The Poisoned Crown, the macabre end of Elizabeth I. Behind the golden mask of England's most powerful queen lay a terrifying secret. Tonight, we enter the rotting silence of Richmond Palace to witness the slow, agonizing disintegration of an icon and the death of the Tudor bloodline. By the winter of 1602, the Golden Age was a decaying illusion. Queen Elizabeth I, aged 70, had become a ghost haunting her own corridors. Her skin, once as smooth as porcelain, was now a map of fragility, hiding a body weathered by nearly half a century of cold, iron-fisted rule. The iron will that had defined the Elizabethan era was finally cracking. While her mind remained sharp, her presence at court had grown sporadic and ghostly. The fire that once radiated from her throne in Whitehall had dimmed, replaced by a chilling silence that filled the Richmond air. Rumors began to bleed through the tapestried walls. The sovereign was fading into the shadows. She had outlived her rivals, buried her suitors, and silenced every threat that rose against her. But now, she was facing a battle against time and biology that she could not win. The blow that truly shattered her was spiritual. The execution of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in 1601, had struck a deep, jagged scar into her soul. He was her favorite, perhaps her last true affection. And the fact that she had signed his death warrant herself was unbearable. Servants noted that she rarely sat, and even less did she speak. In her final winter, she spent long hours standing in absolute silence, staring into the cold ash of the fireplace. It was as if she were searching for the ghosts of her past in the gray remains of a burnt-out hearth. Her voice, once capable of rousing armies at Tilbury, was now thin and trailing like smoke. She refused to eat, refused to sit, and dismissed the prayers of her ministers. Something weighed on her heart heavier than the Tudor crown itself, a crushing sense of finality and total solitude. As March 1603 approached, the gloom in her private chambers deepened. The vibrant court, famous for its music and pageantry, had grown hushed. The Queen, who had dazzled Europe with her wit, was now wrapped in heavy silks, surrounded by shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Her ladies-in-waiting were dismissed one by one until she remained mostly alone. Even the few she allowed to stay spoke only in soft, uncertain tones. They whispered that her mind was slipping, drifting away from the world of the living into a dark, silent void where time had no meaning. It was during this period that a peculiar and disturbing phobia took hold: a war against sleep. Elizabeth refused to lie down, standing rooted to the same spot for hours. She believed that the very act of reclining would be an invitation for death to claim her royal soul. When her legs could no longer support her, she would sit stiffly on cushions on the floor, eyes fixed on some invisible point. She feared death not just as a woman, but as a ruler. To die meant to relinquish control of her people, her image, and the power she had died to protect. Physically, her health declined in ways both subtle and certain. A persistent, hacking cough echoed through the silent palace. Her skin turned increasingly pale, almost translucent, and her frame seemed to shrink beneath her ornate gowns. The weight loss was alarming, yet she forbade any help. Her vanity remained intact even in the face of agony. She forbade her physicians from examining her too closely, guarding the secrets of her decaying body with the same ferocity she had guarded her borders. One question loomed. Was this old age, or was something hidden festering within? To understand the weight pressing down on her, one must look at the ghost of Essex. Their relationship had been volatile. He was dashing, impulsive, and eventually dangerous. When he launched his failed coup, Elizabeth had no choice but to uphold the law of the crown over the law of the heart. Some claimed she carried a locket containing his portrait until her final breath. Others swore she muttered his name in the dead of night. The Queen, who had once seemed untouchable, now appeared human and deeply wounded, her laughter replaced by a silence that no music could break. Grief in the 17th century was poorly understood. What we now recognize as clinical depression was seen as melancholia, a spiritual imbalance. But those around her saw it for what it was, the light of a long rain flickering out, because the will to continue had simply evaporated. The courtiers who had once competed for her favor now stepped cautiously. They feared her moods, unsure how far her sorrow might drag her down. She stopped approving documents. She stopped attending chapel. Most shocking of all, the woman who adored music now demanded absolute silence. But the most insidious killer wasn't grief. It was her face. For decades, the Queen had adorned herself with a signature white mask of beauty. This thick layer of cosmetic powder, known as Venetian ceruse, was a fashion born of the aristocracy to signal nobility and eternal youth. The mixture contained two primary lethal ingredients: vinegar and white lead. We now know lead is a neurotoxin, but for Elizabeth, it was a daily ritual. Applied layer upon layer, the lead was absorbed through her skin, slowly poisoning the very mind that had built the English Empire. The symptoms of lead poisoning read like a dark diary of her final months: fatigue, depression, tremors, and loss of appetite. Her contemporaries noted that her teeth had blackened and fallen out, a common sign of the chemical rot that was claiming her from the inside out. Her hair, once bright and flame red, had thinned and disappeared. Beneath the white paint, her skin was marked by sores and blemishes, the spirit of Saturn at work. Yet she remained committed to the illusion, presenting an image of youth even as her body rebelled against her. That makeup was not just vanity, it was armor. And like any armor, it came with a crushing weight. Modern historians believe that long-term lead exposure magnified the depression she felt after the death of Essex, creating a chemical imbalance that stole her sanity and her peace. By the second week of March 1603, the condition of the Queen became undeniable. Her courtiers moved with urgency, trying to hide the panic. She had stopped eating entirely. Her bones were visible beneath the ornate fabrics, her frame retreating into itself as if trying to vanish. Tudor medicine had no clear diagnostic tools. There were no thermometers or microscopes. Illness was a matter of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these were imbalanced, death followed. Their treatments, like bleeding and purging, only served to hasten her end. Modern scholars suggest she may have succumbed to pneumonia. The damp air of Richmond, mixed with her fasting and long hours of standing, likely led to a lung infection. Without antibiotics, a persistent cough in a 70-year-old body was a death sentence, yet she rejected all medicine. She would not allow incisions or bleedings. She even refused to undress completely, guarding her modesty and her secrets to the very last breath. The silence around her became part of the illness, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere where even the ministers watched, helpless and afraid. As she faded, the immense weight of rule became a physical burden. For 44 years, she had been the embodiment of England. Her crown was a living thing, fed by every decision she made. But now, in the stillness of her chamber, that crown sat heavy and unclaimed by any heir. Elizabeth had no children. The Tudor line, so fiercely defended, was ending with her. She had long resisted naming a successor, perhaps because doing so meant acknowledging her own mortality. The question of what comes next loomed over the palace like a gathering winter storm. The most obvious candidate was James VI of Scotland, the son of the woman Elizabeth had executed. The irony was profound. Factions existed, and old grudges remained. Catholic claimants lurked in the shadows. England could not be left rudderless, yet the Queen remained stubbornly silent. Some say she gestured when asked if James should be king, a subtle nod or a flicker of the eyes. Others claim she whispered, "I will have no rascal to succeed me." But there is no record, no firm confirmation. The monarch of eloquent speeches would not speak her final, most vital decision. In her mind, acknowledging a successor might have been equal to surrendering. To name a king was to admit that her era was truly closing. For a woman who had ruled as a goddess, that admission was perhaps more painful than the physical rot spreading through her lead-poisoned veins. As the hours grew colder, the vigil became endless. Days and nights blended together. To those attending her, it seemed she was terrified of rest. In Tudor times, sleep was seen as a temporary death, a time when the soul drifted dangerously close to the beyond. She wouldn't risk it. Her attendants begged her to lie down, but she resisted with a force that defied her frail appearance. Her refusal was rooted in a mix of superstition and the sheer Tudor stubbornness that had allowed her to survive the plots of Spain and the betrayals of her own council. The swelling in her legs worsened, a sign of systemic failure. Her breathing grew shallow and labored. Still, she sat on the floor, propped by cushions, refusing the bed. It was as if she were standing watch over her own death, refusing to give the grim reaper an invitation to enter. Eventually, her strength betrayed her. She collapsed several times, once found crumpled beside her chair, unwilling to cry out for help. After that, her ladies-in-waiting took turns hovering like ghosts, staying close but speaking only in whispers, if they dared to speak at all. The atmosphere was one of reverence and dread. When at last she agreed to be placed in bed, it was not out of peace, but sheer, total exhaustion. Her body had given out. She was lowered into the silk covers like a fragile relic, and for many, it felt like the final curtain call. The moment she lay down, the chamber transformed. The silence grew heavier. Advisors and physicians gathered, aware that they were witnessing the closing of an age. The Tudor dynasty, which had emerged from the fire of the Wars of the Roses, was breathing its last in a darkened room. Outside, the palace held its breath. No proclamations were issued, no bells tolled. Only whispers passed through the corridors of Richmond. Those who had served her for decades stood still, waiting for a sign or a farewell that the Queen was no longer capable of giving. Elizabeth communicated only through faint movements. Some claimed they saw her reach toward the crown resting nearby. Others believed she gestured toward a portrait of the presumed successor. But the woman who once roused nations with her words would leave the world in absolute silence. What did she see in those final hours? Perhaps visions of the girl imprisoned in the tower by her sister Mary. Perhaps the ships of the Armada burning on the horizon. A life of immense power, yet shadowed by an inescapable solitude that only a sovereign could truly understand. As the final hours unfolded, the Queen no longer responded to touch or sound. Her skin took on an ashen hue, the fire in her becoming a flickering ember. Lady Scrope, her faithful attendant, stayed by her side, dabbing her brow with rose water as the world outside began to tilt. Richmond Palace was wrapped in anxiety. Messengers stood ready at the gates, horses saddled, prepared to gallop toward Scotland the moment the breath stopped. Robert Cecil stood ready with his papers, his greatest political maneuver, uniting two crowns, dependent on this final moment. Just before dawn on March 24th, 1603, the end came. No cry, no gasp. Just a sudden, profound silence. The room remained motionless for a full minute, as if all feared the breath might return. Then Lady Scrope covered the Queen's face. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, was dead. Her passing was not marked by fanfare or the final rites of a priest. She had refused them all. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, surrounded not by family, but by the weight of her own history. A monarch born of scandal had passed into legend with her dignity intact. The death sent a chill across the kingdom. She was the only ruler many had ever known. Her image was stamped onto their coins and their consciences. Now, that image was still. The Tudor line was gone, leaving a throne without a voice and a realm uncertain of its next heartbeat. Immediately after her death, her body was left undisturbed, guarded by ladies whispering psalms. A single candle burned at her bedside. The cloth over her face did not conceal her identity. It preserved it, giving the nation one last moment to believe she hadn't truly left them. While grief settled in Richmond, the wheels of power were turning. Robert Cecil moved with clinical speed. His secret correspondence with James VI had prepared for this day. The couriers were sent, riding through the muddy spring roads to transform two kingdoms forever. Back in London, the court kept the death quiet for hours, fearing unrest. But word seeped out through servants, merchants, and clergy. The Queen was gone, and with her, the era of the Tudors. There was no personal heir, only the political hope that the transition would be bloodless. Within hours, the council declared James VI of Scotland as James I of England. A new dynasty began, but the nation mourned the woman who had shaped their age. When her body was prepared for burial, the meticulous illusion she had guarded so fiercely finally began to fall away. Her ladies saw what had been hidden: the bruised skin, the skeletal hands, the wispy white hair. The mask of youth was gone, revealing a woman who had carried a kingdom on her back for 40 years and paid for it with her body. She was no longer a goddess, but a tired human soul. Her burial was delayed to allow for a month of national mourning. She lay in state, dressed in royal robes, the orb and scepter by her side. For all her imperfections, her people came to pay respect to the person she had become, a woman of contradictions, fierce and fragile. On April 28, 1603, the procession moved toward Westminster Abbey. Thousands lined the streets in solemn silence. The coffin was draped in velvet, topped with a lifelike effigy of the Queen in her full regalia. Some mourners believed it was her actual body, propped upright in death. She was interred in the vault beside her sister, Mary Vi, a symbolic reunion of rivals. The inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, in the hope of one resurrection." The Tudor dynasty was sealed in the dark, and the Elizabethan age was over. More than 4 centuries have passed, yet the mystery of her death remains. Was it age, pneumonia, or the chemical assassin in her makeup? Historians still debate the spirit of Saturn, the lead that gifted her a white mask but stole her nerves, her mind, and her final years. Others point to her rotted teeth, a direct consequence of her love for sugar, which provided a gateway for sepsis to poison her blood. Or, perhaps, it was simply a heart that had broken long ago, unable to bear the solitude of a crown that demanded everything and gave nothing back. Elizabeth I reigned alone, carving her image into the soul of England. She transformed a fractured island into a global power, confident and vibrant. But her death revealed the fragility of that image. She held it together through raw personality, leaving a silence no king could fill. Her final silence was her last masterstroke. She exited on her own terms, offering no dying gasp for pity. In life, she was a master of performance. In death, she let the silence speak louder than words. She died a symbol, a mask, and a myth that refuses to fade from history. To look at her now is to see the ultimate price of power. The jewels, the gowns, and the poetic rhetoric were the armor of a woman who chose to be a sovereign over being a person. The Golden Age was finished in lead, leaving behind a legacy that still thunders through time. We remember her not just for her victories, but for the standing vigil in a darkened room. Elizabeth I, the queen who conquered the world, but lost her reflection in the process. Her flame is out, the Tudor line is dead, but her legend remains as cold and bright as the stars. The bitter seed, the bloody rise of a global obsession. Long before it was a sweet indulgence, it was a dark, frothy ritual of gods and blood. Tonight, we unwrap the crushing weight of chocolate's history, a journey from sacred jungle altars to the brutal mechanics of empire. Deep within the suffocating humidity of the Mesoamerican rainforest, a strange tree bore fruit that would change the world. The Olmecs, ghosts of a lost civilization, were the first to tame the cacao pod. They didn't seek sweetness. They sought a gateway to the divine through bitterness. To the Maya, cacao was not food. It was a cosmic substance, gifted by the gods of creation. In their sacred texts, the blood of the ancients was said to be mixed with cacao and maize to form the first humans. To drink it was to consume the very essence of life and death itself. Imagine a drink that tasted of cold ash, earth, and fire. The Maya blended crushed beans with water, chili peppers, and cornmeal. They poured it between vessels from great heights, creating a thick, stagnant foam that was prized as the breath of the heavens in their stone cities. Cacao followed the Maya into the grave. Archaeologists have uncovered exquisite pottery and burial chambers, still stained with the residue of a final offering. For a noble soul to cross into the underworld, it needed the bitter strength of the bean to navigate the shadows of Xibalba. By the time the Aztec Empire rose, cacao had become more than a ritual. It was a cold, hard currency. In the markets of Tenochtitlan, a single bean could buy a tomato. 100 could buy a human life. It was a currency that literally grew on trees, guarded by the elite like gold. The Aztecs believed the god Quetzalcoatl stole cacao from paradise to give to humanity. For this act of mercy, he was exiled. Every cup of zocolatl consumed by an Aztec warrior was a reminder of a stolen gift, a liquid fire meant to invigorate the body for the coming of war. Emperor Montezuma II lived in a state of chocolate-induced intoxication. Legend says he consumed 50 golden goblets a day, believing it gave him virility and godlike focus. He threw the golden cups into a lake after one use, a testament to the staggering wealth of a bitter seed. The drink was served cold, thick, and spicy. It was a far cry from the creamy confections of today. To the Aztec, chocolate was the taste of power, reserved for priests, lords, and those about to be sacrificed. It was the last thing a victim tasted before the obsidian knife fell. In 1519, the worlds collided. When Hernán Cortés arrived, he didn't find a primitive people. He found a civilization obsessed with a dark liquid. The Spanish conquistadors watched in silence as Montezuma sipped his froth, unaware that this bean would outlast the gold they came to steal. At first, the Spanish found the drink repulsive. They described it as a drink for pigs, a bitter, oily sludge that turned the stomach. But they couldn't ignore the stamina it provided. A soldier could march all day on a single cup. The strategic value of cacao began to outweigh its taste. As Tenochtitlan burned and the Aztec gods were silenced, the cacao bean survived. Cortés brought the first crates back to Spain, not as a delicacy, but as a pharmaceutical curiosity. In the quiet laboratories of Spanish monasteries, monks began to experiment with the dark Mesoamerican fruit. The secret stayed hidden behind monastery walls for decades. The monks were the first to make a fateful change. They removed the chili and added sugar. Suddenly, the bitter warrior's brew became a seductive, sweet indulgence. The beast was tamed, and a global hunger was born. By the 17th century, chocolate was the ultimate symbol of European status. It was the drink of the Spanish court, a luxury so rare that it was protected by royal decree. To sip chocolate was to signal that you owned a piece of the new world, regardless of the blood soaked into the soil. The European palate demanded more. As the obsession spread to France, Italy, and England, the demand for cacao skyrocketed. The forests of Central and South America were no longer enough. The colonial machine began to look for new lands and a more efficient way to extract the dark prize. This is where the sweetness ends. To feed the rising hunger of European salons, the colonial powers established vast plantations. But cacao trees were temperamental, requiring back-breaking labor in tropical heat. The solution was the most brutal system in human history: slavery. The transatlantic slave trade was the hidden engine of the chocolate industry. Millions were stolen from Africa, packed into the hulls of ships, and forced onto plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean. The drink of the gods was now being cultivated through the agony of the enslaved. Imagine the irony. A substance once used to honor the gods of life was now the primary reason for a systemic industry of death. On these plantations, the smell of fermenting cacao beans mingled with the stench of sweat and disease. The beans were dried in the sun, fueled by human misery. Sugarcane followed the same path. The two industries, chocolate and sugar, became inseparable, a twin engine of exploitation. To make chocolate palatable to a Parisian aristocrat, an enslaved person in the Caribbean had to be worked to the point of collapse under a relentless sun. The commodification of cacao stripped it of its spirit. It was no longer a sacred link to the divine. It was a product, a row in a ledger, a bulk cargo to be taxed and traded. The beans were shipped across the Atlantic in the same waters that carried the bodies of the dead. In the drawing rooms of London, chocolate was served in elegant silver pots. Aristocrats discussed philosophy and art while sipping a liquid that was, quite literally, the product of blood. The disconnect between the luxury of the cup and the horror of the field was absolute and chilling. By the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution brought new machines to the process. In 1828, Casparus van Houten Sr. invented the cocoa press. This machine could squeeze the fatty butter out of the bean, leaving a dry powder behind. It was a breakthrough that made chocolate cheaper and easier. This Dutch process made chocolate accessible to the masses. It was no longer just for kings, but as the price dropped, the pressure on the plantations increased. The abolition of slavery didn't end the exploitation. It merely changed its face, shifting into a system of debt and forced labor. In 1847, Joseph Fry discovered that by adding cacao butter back into the powder along with sugar, he could create a solid bar. The first modern chocolate bar was born. It was portable, durable, and ready for mass consumption. The drink had become a snack, but the history remained bitter. The Swiss took it further. Daniel Peter and Henri Nestlé experimented for years to find a way to combine milk with chocolate. In 1875, they succeeded. Milk chocolate was smoother, creamier, and even more addictive. The world was now fully under the spell of the bean, regardless of the cost. Rodolphe Lindt invented the conching machine in 1879. By stirring the chocolate for hours, it removed the grittiness and developed a velvet texture. This was the birth of the luxury chocolate we recognize today. The physical process was perfected, but the shadows in the supply chain deepened. As the 1900s dawned, the center of cacao production shifted to West Africa, specifically to the Gold Coast and Ivory Coast. The colonial powers saw these regions as the ultimate source of cheap labor. Large-scale monoculture began to replace the diverse ecosystems of the African tropics. The industrial titans rose: Hershey, Cadbury, Mars. They built empires on the back of the bean. Milton Hershey created a literal town built on chocolate, promising a utopia for his workers. But the source of his cacao remained a world away, hidden in the dense, unmonitored forests of Africa. During World War I and II, chocolate was a vital ration. It wasn't just candy, it was a psychological weapon. Soldiers carried it in their pockets as a reminder of home. The logistics of joy relied on a global network of trade that was still quietly steeped in systemic inequality. Even today, the dark side of the bean persists. In the 21st century, reports of child labor and human trafficking in the cacao industry continue to haunt the headlines. Most of the world's cacao comes from small farms in West Africa, where poverty is the only thing that grows faster than the trees. Children as young as 10 are often found using machetes to harvest pods they will never taste. They carry heavy sacks of beans through the forest, their education sacrificed to the global demand for a sweet treat. The ghost of the plantation still walks the modern supply chain. The environmental cost is equally staggering. To make room for more cacao trees, vast tracts of rainforest have been decimated. In West Africa, national parks have been illegally cleared. The lungs of the planet are being traded for the fleeting pleasure of a chocolate bar. Modern movements like Bean to Bar and Fair Trade attempt to heal these wounds. Small batch makers work directly with farmers, paying premium prices and ensuring ethical conditions. They are trying to restore the dignity that was stripped from the cacao bean 5 centuries ago. When you taste a piece of high-quality dark chocolate today, you are tasting a complex profile: fruit, earth, smoke, and bitterness. This is the true voice of the cacao bean, a voice that was silenced for years by industrial sugar and the sanitized marketing of massive corporations. The history of chocolate is a mirror of our own civilization. It reflects our capacity for ritual, our hunger for discovery, and our dark tendency to build luxury on the suffering of others. It is a story of how a sacred seed was broken by the machines of man and turned into profit. We live in an era of chocolate amnesia. We buy the colorful wrappers and ignore the shadows behind the bean. But the history is there, etched into every pod and every bean. It is a story that is both delicious and devastating, a reminder that sweetness always comes at a price. Consider the anatomy of the cacao pod. It looks like a heart, protected by a hard, ridged shell. Inside, the beans are surrounded by a white, sweet pulp, but the heart of the bean itself is intensely bitter. It is a biological metaphor for the history of the product itself. From the blood-stained altars of the Aztecs to the industrial factories of the 19th century, chocolate has been a witness to the best and worst of humanity. It has been a medicine, a poison, a currency, and a sin. Its journey across the Atlantic was a journey through the dark soul of empire. The next time you hold a piece of chocolate, think of the frost in the European salons and the sweltering heat of the African groves. Think of the Maya priests and the enslaved laborers. The bean has traveled through time and blood to reach your hand. Its story is far from finished. Chocolate is the ultimate paradox. It is the gift of the gods and the tool of tyrants. It brings joy to millions while casting a long shadow over the regions that produce it. We are still writing the final blocks of its history, choosing whether it will be a story of greed or a return to grace. In the dark, humid silence of a cacao grove, the trees still grow in the shade of giants. They are quiet witnesses to the cycles of human obsession. They don't care for our ledgers or our wrappers. They only know the slow ripening of the bean and the ancient rhythm of the rainforest. The process of making chocolate is almost alchemical. Fermentation, roasting, winnowing, and conching. It is a transformation of a raw, bitter fruit into a sophisticated sensory experience. But no machine can remove the historical weight that is baked into the chemistry of the cacao bean. We are addicted to the chemical hit of theobromine and caffeine. It triggers a release of dopamine, a fleeting moment of bliss. But the true depth of chocolate lies in its bitterness. It is a flavor that demands attention, a flavor that reminds us of the earth and the struggle to survive. To truly appreciate chocolate is to acknowledge its scars. It is to look past the sugar and see the faces of the people who tended the trees. It is to recognize that the drink of the gods was never meant to be easy or cheap. It was meant to be sacred, respected, and shared with care. The grim ledger of chocolate is filled with names we will never know. The Maya who died in the fields, the enslaved who died in the hulls, and the children who labor today. Their stories are the true ingredients of the bar, the invisible texture that gives it its lingering, complex finish. We have reached the end of this journey, but the bean continues to grow. Its future is in our hands. Will we continue to choose the sanitized industrial lie? Or will we demand a return to the integrity of the sacred jungle seed? The choice is as bitter and sweet as the chocolate itself. The scent of roasting cacao is ancient. It evokes memories of a time when the world was vast and mysterious. It is the scent of transition, of a seed breaking open to reveal its power. It is a scent that has wafted through palaces and slave quarters alike, a constant in a changing world. Let the darkness of the history settle like the sediment in an ancient Mayan cup. Let it remind you that nothing we consume is without a past. Chocolate is a lesson in global connectivity, a reminder that our pleasures are often tethered to the lives of people on the other side of the globe. Tonight, as the lights dim and the world grows quiet, remember the bitter heart of the cacao pod. Remember that history is not just about what we built, but what we sacrificed to build it. The story of chocolate is our story, a dark, complex, and unyielding chronicle of human desire. The bean remains. The history is written in the soil. Chocolate, the eternal gift, the persistent shadow, and the enduring taste of a world that is forever trying to balance the bitter with the sweet. The ledger remains open, and the next block of the story is waiting to be carved. To look closer at the bean is to see the map of the world. Each ridge on the cacao pod is like a mountain range on a distant continent. The beans inside are the inhabitants, huddled together in the dark, waiting for the light to break through their protective shell and release their potential. The science of chocolate is a mystery of fat and sugar crystals. Tempering it requires precise heat and cooling, a delicate dance of physics that creates the perfect snap. But the human element is far less precise. It is messy, filled with the friction of greed and the heat of exploitation. We have turned a divine medicine into a hollow calorie. We have replaced the rich, complex fats of the cacao butter with palm oil and chemicals. In doing so, we have moved further away from the forest and deeper into the artificial light of the supermarket. We have lost the soul of the seed. But the forest is still there. In remote pockets of the Amazon and the Andes, ancient varieties of cacao still grow wild. These are the heirloom beans, the biological survivors of the colonial purge. They carry flavors that haven't been tasted in centuries: floral, spicy, and untamed. These wild trees are the hope for the future. They represent a return to biodiversity and a move away from the destructive monocultures of the industrial age. To save the chocolate of the future, we must look to the wisdom of the past and the resilience of the jungle itself. Every time a small-scale farmer is paid a living wage for their cacao, a piece of the historical injustice is healed. It is a slow, quiet revolution. It is the process of turning the grim ledger into a record of restoration, one bean at a time, one harvest at a time. The psychological power of chocolate is undeniable. It is the food of love, of sorrow, and of celebration. It is our universal language of comfort. But comfort that ignores the suffering of the producer is a hollow piece. True comfort comes from knowing the path of the product was clean. Think of the ships that currently cross the Atlantic. They carry millions of tons of cacao, a silent river of dark potential. They are the modern heirs to the galleons of the conquistadors. The technology has changed, but the fundamental trade, exchanging the jungle for the city, remains the same. The bitter truth is that we often value the wrapper more than the bean. We value the brand more than the farmer. We have been trained to look at the surface, to enjoy the sweetness without questioning the origin. It is time to peel back the foil and look at the reality beneath. Chocolate is a ghost story. The ghosts of the Maya, the Aztecs, and the enslaved millions are still there, trapped in the chemistry of the cacao. They speak to us through the bitterness. They ask us to remember that their lives were the price paid for our most common and casual pleasure. The fermentation process of the cacao bean is a controlled rot. For 5 to 7 days, the beans sit in boxes, sweating under banana leaves. Microbes consume the sweet pulp, generating heat that kills the germ inside the bean. This death is necessary for the flavor of chocolate to be born. Without this rot, there is no chocolate. The chemistry of the bean must be broken down by heat and bacteria to release the precursors of flavor. It is a biological metaphor for the history of the product. Through the breakdown of the old, a new and seductive reality is created. Once the beans are dried, they are roasted. The heat of the fire triggers the Maillard reaction, the same chemical magic that browns a steak or crusts a loaf of bread. Over 600 volatile compounds are released, creating the intoxicating aroma that has haunted human desire for 3 millennia. Roasting is where the terroir of the bean meets the skill of the maker. A light roast preserves the bright acidity of the jungle. A dark roast brings out the deep, smoky notes of the fire. It is the moment where the raw fruit of the tree is finally and irrevocably turned into chocolate. Winnowing follows. The roasted beans are crushed, and the light, papery husks are blown away by a current of air. What remains are the nibs, the pure, concentrated essence of cacao. This is the raw material of empire, the dark rubble that built the fortunes of the European elite. These nibs are then ground into cocoa liquor. It isn't alcohol. It is a thick, dark paste made of equal parts cacao solids and cacao butter. In the 18th century, this was done by hand on heated stones. The labor was grueling, often performed by the lowest classes, or the enslaved. Imagine the heat of the stone, the rhythm of the stone roller, and the persistent, heavy scent of chocolate filling a small, poorly ventilated room. For the worker, chocolate wasn't a treat. It was a physical burden, a source of sore muscles and stained skin. It was a life of grinding toil. The invention of the hydraulic press changed the physical labor, but it also changed the product. By separating the butter from the solids, it allowed for the creation of cocoa powder. This was the birth of the instant drink, the moment chocolate became a predictable industrial commodity. This separation was the ultimate act of industrialization. The bean was no longer a whole entity. It was a collection of parts to be sold separately. Cacao butter became a valuable ingredient in cosmetics and pharmaceuticals, while the solids were sold as the purity of cocoa powder. This division mirrored the social divisions of the time. The rich kept the butter of the world, the profit and the luxury, while the workers were left with the solids, the hard reality of labor, and the dry powder of existence. Chocolate had become a map of the class struggle itself. When sugar was added to the solids and butter, it created a chemical dependency. Sugar and fat together trigger the brain's reward centers in a way that few other foods can. It was the perfect industrial product, portable, non-perishable, and biologically designed to keep you coming back. The marketing of chocolate in the 19th and 20th centuries was a masterpiece of sanitization. Colorful boxes featured images of alpine cows, happy children, and tropical paradises. The reality of the West African groves and the Caribbean plantations was carefully airbrushed out of the frame. We were sold a story of childhood wonder and romantic love. We were told that chocolate was a reward for hard work, a gift for a sweetheart, or a comfort for a broken heart. The grim ledger was replaced by the golden ticket, a fantasy that allowed us to consume without guilt. But the truth is more persistent than marketing. In every bar of chocolate, there is the ghost of the jungle and the echo of the plantation. The sweetness is just a thin veneer over a history that is as complex and dark as the deepest forest. We must learn to taste the whole story. The craft chocolate movement is a reclamation of the whole bean. It is an attempt to put the butter back into the solids, to reconnect the consumer with the farmer, and to honor the sacred origin of the seed. It is a return to the integrity of the Maya and the power of the Aztecs. This movement asks us to slow down, to smell the nibs, to taste the origin, and to ask the hard questions. It is a movement of transparency in an industry that has been built on shadows. It is the process of making chocolate human again, one small batch at a time, one farm at a time. Consider the conche. For up to 72 hours, the chocolate is stirred and aerated. This process rounds off the jagged edges of the particles and develops the flavor. It is a slow, mechanical meditation. It is the final step in the transformation of the bitter seed into the smooth icon. But even the best conche cannot remove the weight of history. The grim ledger remains. As we move into the future, the challenge for the chocolate industry is to ensure that the snap of the bar isn't the only thing that is clean and sharp. The ethics must be just as perfect. We are the consumers of the 21st century. We have the power of the purse and the power of the click. We can choose to support the industrial machines that profit from shadows. Or we can choose the makers who bring light to the groves. The future of chocolate is our decision. The bean is a resilient thing. It has survived the fall of empires, the brutality of slavery, and the standardization of the industrial age. It is a survivor of human greed. It still grows in the quiet corners of the world, waiting for us to recognize its true value and its dark history. The sound of a cacao pod being cracked open is a sharp, organic snap. It is the sound of a secret being revealed. Inside, the beans look like rows of white teeth, nestled in their sweet, sticky pulp. It is a visceral, anatomical sight, a reminder that chocolate is a product of life. This pulp is often discarded in industrial production, but in the jungle, it is a delicacy. It tastes of lychee, honey, and lime. It is the fleeting sweetness that protects the bitter heart of the bean. It is a reminder that the jungle offers a complexity that the factory can never replicate. In some parts of South America, the pulp is fermented into a potent wine. This cacao wine was likely the very first form of chocolate ever consumed by humans. It was an intoxicant, a wild, fermented juice that predates the roasted bean by centuries. It was the original spirit of cacao. Imagine the first human to ever taste that fermented juice. The surprise of the sweetness, the kick of the alcohol, and the lingering bitterness of the seeds. It was a moment of accidental discovery that would eventually lead to the global empires of Hershey and Nestlé. But as we moved toward the bean, we moved toward the fire. Roasting changed the chemistry and the culture. It allowed the product to be stored, transported, and commodified. The wine of the jungle became the coin of the empire, and the sacred juice was lost to the roasted solid. This shift from liquid to solid, from juice to bean, from sacred to secular, is the fundamental arc of chocolate's history. It is a story of how we take the wild, unpredictable gifts of nature and turn them into the predictable, profitable units of commerce. We trade the soul for the shelf. Today, the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Project is trying to save the oldest DNA of the cacao tree. They are looking for the mother trees, the ancient ancestors that haven't been touched by industrial breeding. These trees are the genetic library of our history and our future. Saving these trees is about more than flavor. It's about survival. In a changing climate, the genetic diversity of the wild cacao is the only shield against the diseases that threaten the global crop. The industrial monocultures are fragile. The jungle is resilient. We need the wild. The grim ledger of the future will be written in the climate. Will the cacao tree survive the rising heat and the changing rains? Will the farmers be able to stay on their land, or will they be forced into the cities, leaving the trees to the encroaching dust and the dying sun? The answer depends on us. If we continue to demand cheap chocolate, we ensure a future of exploitation and environmental collapse. If we learn to value the bean as the Maya did, as a sacred, rare, and powerful gift, we can build a history that is worthy of the divine seed. Let the bitterness of the story linger on your tongue. Let it be a reminder that nothing truly valuable is ever free. Chocolate is a gift that comes with a heavy responsibility. It is a dark, complex mirror of our own souls, reflecting back both our greed and our capacity for grace. The jungle is quiet tonight. In the groves of Ghana and the forests of Peru, the cacao pods are ripening in the dark. They don't know about the global markets or the grim ledger. They only know the earth, the rain, and the slow, steady process of turning soil into soul. We are the ones who give the bean its meaning. We are the ones who decide if it will be a tool of oppression or a vessel for restoration. The history is long, the shadows are deep, but the light is starting to find its way back into the groves. The choice remains with the consumer. The snap of a well-tempered bar is a sound of order. It is the sound of fat crystals locking into place. But the history of the bean is a story of disorder, of stolen lives, broken treaties, and shattered cultures. We must learn to hear both the snap and the silence behind it. The spirit of chocolate is still there, hidden beneath the sugar and the foil. It is a spirit of the forest, a spirit of the ancients, and a spirit of the workers who tended the trees. It is a spirit that demands to be heard, to be respected, and to be finally, truly honored. We have reached the final blocks of this chronicle. The story of chocolate is a dark, winding path through the heart of human history. It is a story that is far from over. It is a story that we participate in every time we unwrap a bar and taste the bitter heart of the bean. May the flavor of the bean remind you of the earth. May the bitterness remind you of the struggle. And may the sweetness, if it must be there, be a reward for a history that is finally being made clean. The ledger is open. The next block is yours to write with your choices. The scent of cacao is the scent of memory. It is the scent of 1,000 generations of humans who have looked at a strange, ridged pod and seen a divine potential. It is a scent that connects us to the rainforest, to the past, and to each other across a vast and broken world. In the end, chocolate is just a seed, but it is a seed that has grown into a global empire. It is a seed that has fueled wars and comforted children. It is a seed that contains the best and worst of us. It is the bitter, frothy, sacred, and sweet essence of being human. The lights are dim. The fan is a soft background hum. The world is quiet. Remember the bean. Remember the history. And remember that even in the darkest of ledgers, there is always the possibility of a new and better chapter. The story of the bitter seed continues in you. The trail of tears, the death of nations, and the hunger for soil. Tonight, we follow the frost-bitten footsteps of those driven into the dark. This is not a story of expansion, but a chronicle of betrayal, a hollow promise etched in the blood of thousands left in the frozen mud. In the early 19th century, a young America was starving. Its hunger wasn't for bread, but for territory. White settlers looked westward, eyes gleaming with the fever of manifest destiny. To them, the vast, ancient forests were not a home, but a resource waiting to be liquidated. The southeastern lands belonged to sovereign nations. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. These were people with constitutions, newspapers, and deep roots. But to the architects of empire, they were merely obstacles in the path of cotton and gold. The Cherokee chose the law over the rifle. They built schools and published bilingual news, hoping to prove their civilization would protect them. They didn't realize that in the eyes of greed, no amount of assimilation can wash away the value of the dirt beneath your feet. In 1830, the shadow fell. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. It was a cold, clinical piece of legislation that authorized the president to swap ancestral homelands for a desolate void across the Mississippi. The ink on that paper carried the scent of a funeral shroud. Jackson was a man who understood only the language of the frontier and the sword. He spoke of protection, but his eyes were on the gold found in the red Georgia clay. Removal was not an option. It was a sentence. He viewed native people as a disappearing race, doomed to wither. The state of Georgia began its assault, stripping the Cherokee of their legal rights and auctioning off their homes while families were still inside. The legal system was a spider web. The small were caught, while the powerful tore through it with the blade of state law. The Cherokee fought back in the Supreme Court and won. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Georgia had no authority over their lands. It was a victory for justice, but justice has no teeth when the executive branch refuses to bite. The ruling was ignored. John Marshall has made his decision, Jackson supposedly sneered. Now let him enforce it. With those words, the Constitution was silenced. The highest law in the land was less than a whisper against the roaring demand for land and the cold indifference of the president. In 1835, a small, unauthorized faction of the Cherokee signed the Treaty of New Echota. They weren't the leaders of the nation, but the U.S. government didn't care. They had the signature they needed to justify the coming horror. The fate of 16,000 people was sealed by a few. Most Cherokee refused to leave. They stayed on their farms, watching the sun rise over the mountains they called the center of the world. They believed the spirit of the law might still save them. They were wrong. The military was already sharpening its bayonets. May 1838. The invasion began. 7,000 soldiers descended on the Cherokee Nation. This wasn't a relocation. It was a rounding up of cattle. Families were sitting down to dinner when the doors were kicked in. The air was filled with the metallic clatter of rifles and screams. Soldiers dragged women from their looms and children from their beds. There was no time to pack. One man was forced out of his home so quickly he left his blind mother sitting in her chair. Behind the soldiers came the looters, scavengers picking through the remains of lives. Homes were torched. The smoke of burning cabins filled the valleys, a gray signal of the end. Crops were left to rot in the fields. Ancestral graves were desecrated by settlers looking for jewelry. Everything the Cherokee had built for a century was reduced to ash and plunder. The first stop was the stockades. Thousands were crammed into makeshift wooden pens. The conditions were visceral. Overcrowding, stagnant water, and the stench of human waste. In the sweltering Georgia summer, these pens became breeding grounds for dysentery and despair. Children died first. Their small bodies were carried out of the pens as the heat pressed down like a lead weight. The soldiers watched with indifference, or worse, with a sense of grim satisfaction. The removal had begun, and the land was already being divided among the victors. The march west was divided into waves. The first groups were sent during the height of summer. The heat was a silent executioner. Water sources were contaminated, and the dust of the trail clogged the lungs. Every mile was marked by the shallow graves of the elderly and the weak. By the time autumn arrived, the main body of the Cherokee began their journey. 13,000 people stretched out in a line of misery that spanned miles. They called it the trail where they cried. It was a slow, agonizing crawl away from everything they loved toward a hollow future. The winter of 1838 was one of the harshest on record. The rain turned to sleet, then to blinding snow. Many had no shoes, their feet wrapped in rags that froze to the earth. The sound of the march was a chorus of rhythmic, wet coughing and the creak of overloaded wagons. Imagine the river crossings. The Ohio River was a churning mass of ice floes. The Cherokee were forced to wait for weeks in the biting wind, huddling under thin blankets. Pneumonia swept through the camps like a scythe, claiming hundreds in the dark, shivering nights. There was a shortage of food. The government contractors, fueled by corruption, provided spoiled meat and weevil-infested flour. Hunger was a constant, gnawing companion. People ate the bark off trees and the leather of their own belts just to stop the cramping in their bellies. Death became a daily ritual. Every morning, the survivors had to wake up and see who hadn't survived the night. Mothers carried dead infants for miles, unable to leave them in the frozen dirt. The trail was a graveyard without headstones, a map of sorrow laid across the continent. One survivor remembered the silence of the march. There were no songs, only the heavy thud of footsteps and the occasional sob. Even the dogs that followed the wagons grew thin and silent, as if they too understood that the world they knew had been erased. By the time they reached Indian Territory in early 1839, over 4,000 Cherokee were gone. 1/4 of the nation had been liquidated by exposure, disease, and the systematic cruelty of a government that viewed them as subhuman. The Promised Land was a barren, alien landscape. The loss was more than biological. It was a cultural decapitation. The elders, the keepers of stories and medicine, had died in the highest numbers. The chain of memory was broken. A people who were once a vibrant nation arrived as a collection of traumatized shadows. The new land was hostile. The soil was different. The water was scarce, and the climate was unpredictable. There were no homes waiting for them, only the raw prairie and the need to start over while still drowning in grief. The trauma was etched into the DNA of the survivors. Internal conflict tore at the heart of the nation. Retribution was swift for those who had signed the unauthorized treaty. Major Ridge, his son John, and Elias Boudinot were all assassinated by their own people. Blood for blood, a cycle of violence born from the betrayal. The Choctaw had been the first to walk. In 1831, they were driven out of Mississippi. They faced a blizzard that turned the trail into a white hell. A Choctaw chief described it as a trail of tears and death, giving a name to the horror that would soon consume all the nations. The Creek followed in 1836, many in chains. 15,000 people were forced to cross the Mississippi. 3,500 did not survive the journey. They were a people of the river, and being forced into the dry plains was a spiritual death long before the physical one arrived. The Chickasaw were pressured into selling their land, hoping for a more orderly removal. But the corruption of the system ensured their journey was just as deadly. Supplies vanished into the pockets of middlemen, leaving the Chickasaw to starve on the roads of Arkansas. The Seminole of Florida refused to go quietly. They retreated into the swamps and fought a guerrilla war that lasted nearly a decade. They cost the U.S. military millions and hundreds of lives. But in the end, most were captured and shipped west like prisoners of war. The scale of the removal was staggering. Over 100,000 indigenous people were displaced. The government called it Indian Territory, but it was a cage. The borders were constantly shrinking as white expansion continued to press inward, hungry for even more. Manifest destiny was a theology of theft. It argued that the land was intended for those who would improve it with fences and plows. In this vision, the indigenous relationship with the land, one of balance and spirit, was seen as a sin against progress. The physical trail may have ended, but the emotional one continued. The historical trauma of the removal created a legacy of poverty, health crises, and psychological scars. It was a wound that refused to scab over, kept open by a century of further broken promises. The government's supplies often arrived late or spoiled. Rations were used as a weapon of control. To eat, the people had to stay within the boundaries. The sovereign nations were being turned into dependents, their dignity traded for survival in a land that didn't want them. Yet, the resilience was profound. In the face of total erasure, the Cherokee rebuilt. They established a new capital at Tahlequah. They reopened their schools and restarted their printing presses. They refused to let the trail be the final chapter of their story. They carried their sacred fires with them. Coal by coal, they kept the flame of their identity alive in the new territory. These fires represented a continuity that no act of Congress could extinguish. They were the burning proof that the nation had survived the frost. The Trail of Tears remains a jagged scar on the American conscience. For decades, it was buried in the footnotes of history books, or framed as a tragic necessity. But the ledger of the grim does not accept excuses. It records only the facts of the suffering. To walk the historic trail today is to walk over the ghosts of children. The route passes through modern towns and quiet pastures, but the soil remembers the weight of the wagons and the salt of the tears. The land is a silent witness to a crime that has never been fully paid for. It was a relocation of souls. When you tear a people from the land that holds their ancestors, you are not just moving bodies. You are ripping out the nervous system of a culture. The Cherokee were part of the mountains. The mountains were part of the Cherokee. The removal was an industrial process. It required logistics, contracts, and an army. It was the first time the United States government used its full bureaucratic power to target a specific ethnic group for total displacement. It was a terrifying preview of modern statecraft. Corruption was the oil in the machine. Suppliers were paid for thousands of blankets that were never delivered. Food meant for the starving was sold on the black market. The Trail of Tears was a profit center for those willing to trade their humanity for a piece of the pie. The soldiers who conducted the removal were often conflicted. Some wrote home about the horror of seeing women and children dying in the mud. Others were brutal, seeing the task as a dirty job that had to be done. The trail revealed the character of everyone who touched it. The silence of the forest along the trail was unnatural. One traveler noted that even the birds seemed to have fled the route of the march. The air was heavy with the collective grief of thousands, a psychic weight that still lingers in the quiet corners of the South. Identity was the target. The goal wasn't just to move people, it was to break the idea of the Indian nation. By scattering families and killing the elders, the architects of removal hoped the tribes would simply dissolve into the general population and vanish. But the tribes did not dissolve. The shared trauma of the trail became a new foundation for unity. It was a fire that forged a different kind of strength, a grim, unyielding determination to exist in spite of a world that demanded their disappearance. The trail is a reminder of the fragility of law. The Cherokee had the highest court in the land on their side. They had the paperwork and the treaties. But law is only as strong as the people who enforce it, and in 1838, the law was a paper shield against a lead bullet. Every March, commemorations are held. People ride horses along the route, retracing the path of their ancestors. They do this not just to mourn, but to remind the world that they are still here. The vanishing race is still standing, their voices rising from the red earth. History is a mirror. When we look at the Trail of Tears, we see the dark reflection of our own capacity for indifference. We see what happens when we prioritize the economy over empathy and land over life. The trail is a warning that is still being written today. The frost has long since melted from the trail, but the chill remains. The story of the removal is the story of a nation's soul in conflict with itself. It is a chronicle of a journey into the dark and the incredible, agonizing light of a people who refused to stay there. Think of the language. The sounds of the Cherokee tongue were nearly silenced by the march. When an elder died on the trail, a library of knowledge and a specific way of seeing the world died with them. The removal was an act of linguistic and intellectual arson. The wagons were filled with the sick and the dying. The jolting of the wheels on the rocky roads was a constant torture for those with broken bones or rotting lungs. There was no medicine, only the occasional sip of foul water, and the hope that the next stop would be the last. The guards often forced the march to continue even during blizzards. Time was money for the contractors, and every day on the trail was a day of lost profit. The human life was a variable in a calculation of speed and cost. The trail was a factory floor of misery. Some Cherokee escaped into the mountains of North Carolina. They hid in the caves and deep forests, evading the soldiers for years. They became the Eastern Band of Cherokee, a living remnant of the original homeland, a small, defiant flame that refused to be relocated. For those who reached the West, the first year was a battle with the grave. They had to build shelters with no tools and plant crops in soil they didn't understand. The death rate remained high for years after the arrival. The Trail of Tears did not end at the state line. The psychological impact of seeing your home burned is a wound that never fully closes. It creates a state of permanent displacement, a feeling that no matter where you are a guest in someone else's world. This existential homelessness became a part of the native psyche. The removal was justified by the idea of civilization versus savagery. But looking back, it is clear where the savagery truly lay. It wasn't in the homes of the Cherokee, it was in the halls of Congress and the hearts of those who viewed people as obstacles to be cleared. The Trail of Tears is a story of ghosts. The ghost of the law, the ghost of the treaties, and the ghosts of the thousands who never made it to the new land. They haunt the geography of America, a silent choir that reminds us of the true price of the ground we stand on. It was a tragedy of the spirit. To be Native American is to be of the land. When that land is stolen, the connection to the Creator is strained. The removal was a spiritual assault, an attempt to sever the cord between a people and the sacred geography of their origin. Yet, the songs survived. The stories survived. The unyielding will to be Cherokee, Creek, or Choctaw survived. The Trail of Tears was meant to be an ending, but it became a brutal, bloody beginning of a new kind of survival. The nations endure, and the ledger remembers. Every mile of the trail was a test of the human heart. Fathers carried their children until their own legs gave out. Granddaughters held the hands of their grandmothers as they took their final breaths in the slush. The trail was a testament to a love that even a state could not crush. The scent of the trail was one of wet wool, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of blood. It was a sensory nightmare that etched itself into the memories of the survivors. Decades later, the smell of wood smoke in autumn would bring back the terror of the rounded-up camps. The stars over the trail were the only things that didn't change. The Cherokee looked up at the same constellations they had known in Georgia, seeking some sign of comfort in the vast, indifferent sky. But the stars offered no heat, and the night was long and full of shadows. The removal was a massive redistribution of wealth. Millions of acres of developed land, farms, orchards, and houses were handed over to white settlers for a fraction of their value. It was one of the largest state-sponsored thefts in the history of the Western world. The Indian Territory was promised to be theirs as long as the grass grows and the water flows. But the grass was soon trampled by new waves of settlers, and the water was diverted for new industries. The promise was a lie before the ink was even dry on the treaty. We must look at the faces in the old daguerreotypes. The eyes of the survivors are hard, filled with a knowledge that no one should have to carry. They had seen the bottom of the world and clawed their way back. They are the faces of a resilience that is almost frightening. The Trail of Tears is a lesson in the power of narrative. For a century, the story was told from the perspective of the winners. It was a story of inevitability. But when the victims tell the story, it becomes a chronicle of a crime, a visceral account of a stolen world. There were those among the white population who protested. Missionaries and activists spoke out against the removal, calling it a stain on the national honor. They were ignored or arrested. Their failure is a reminder that morality is often a weak voice against the roar of profit. The trail was a laboratory for the techniques of modern genocide. The rounding up into camps, the forced marches, the systematic starvation, all these tactics would be seen again in the 20th century. The Trail of Tears was a dark innovation in the management of human misery. The geography of the trail is a geography of loss. From the hills of Tennessee to the plains of Oklahoma, the earth is layered with the memory of the displaced. Every river crossing is a site of mourning. Every mountain pass is a monument to those who couldn't make the climb. The Cherokee language has a word for the removal, Dijetsi-yi. It refers to the place where they were taken away. It is a word that carries the weight of 1,000 wagons and the cold of 100 winters. It is a word that is still spoken with a shudder. The livestock died too. The horses and cattle that the Cherokee tried to bring with them were often the first to succumb to the cold and the lack of forage. The loss of the animals was a loss of livelihood, and a further blow to the hope of starting over in the new land. The guards would often shoot those who couldn't keep up. It wasn't a formal policy, but it happened in the dark corners of the trail where no one was watching. The trail was a place where the rules of civilization were suspended, and only the raw power of the gun remained. Think of the psychological toll on the soldiers. Some were haunted for life by what they had done. One soldier later wrote, "I fought through the Civil War and have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by thousands. But the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew. The Trail of Tears was the end of the dream of coexistence. It proved that no matter how much a native nation adapted, they would never be seen as equal. It set the stage for a century of Indian wars and the systematic confinement of indigenous peoples to reservations. But the nations refused to be confined in spirit. They created a state within a state, maintaining their own laws and traditions in the heart of the West. They turned a prison into a home, a barren prairie into a sanctuary. It was a victory of the will over the machine. The story of the Trail is a story of the power of memory. By refusing to forget, the descendants of the survivors have ensured that the crime remains part of the present. They have turned their grief into a political force, a demand for recognition and justice that will not be silenced. The Trail of Tears is a dark thread in the fabric of the American flag. You cannot understand the country without understanding the trail. It is the shadow that defines the light. It is the cost of the liberty that others enjoyed at the expense of those who were there first. The wind on the plains of Oklahoma still carries the echo of the trail. If you listen closely, you can hear the creak of the wheels and the soft, rhythmic coughing of the marchers. It is a sound that will never go away, a permanent part of the American soundtrack. The ledger of the trail is still being calculated. Every year, new stories are uncovered, new graves are identified, and the scale of the tragedy grows. It is a history that refuses to stay buried, a chronicle of sorrow that demands to be read, block by painful block. Imagine the night camps. The only warmth came from small, smoky fires that barely cut the chill of the frozen ground. Thousands of people huddled together, the sounds of grief mixing with the howling of the winter wind. There was no safety, only the wait for the next day's march. The women were the backbone of the survival. They gathered what little food they could, cared for the sick, and kept the children moving. In the face of absolute collapse, the domestic strength of the Cherokee was what prevented the total extinction of the people. The trail was a lesson in the limits of empathy. People in the towns the march passed through often watched with curiosity, as if viewing a parade. Some offered bread, others shouted insults. The trail revealed the wide spectrum of human response to the suffering of the other. Corruption in the distribution of blankets was particularly deadly. Many blankets were taken from hospitals where people had died of smallpox. This wasn't just negligence, it was biological warfare. The trail was a site of overlapping horrors, a convergence of all the ways a human can die. The Cherokee had been a nation of farmers and traders. On the trail, they were turned into refugees. This shift in identity was a profound trauma. To go from being a provider to being a beggar in a stockade is a psychological blow that can destroy a person faster than hunger. Yet, the tribal governments continued to function even on the move. John Ross, the principal chief, managed the logistics of the later detachments, ensuring that some semblance of order and dignity was maintained. Even in exile, they remained a nation, not a mob. The removal was a total war on the indigenous family. By tearing people from their homes and scattering them across 1,000 miles, the government hoped to destroy the kinship ties that made the nations strong. but the trail only bound those ties tighter in the shared blood of the path. The geography of the trail is a map of betrayal. Every landmark, the Tennessee River, the Mississippi, the Arkansas, is a site where a promise was broken. The water flows over the memory of the dead, a liquid archive of a nation's dishonor and a people's agony. The Trail of Tears ended for some in the first months. For others, the effects lasted a lifetime. Many who survived the march died shortly after arrival, their bodies simply too broken to continue. The trail was a slow-motion catastrophe that took years to fully unfold. To tell this story is to honor the dead. It is to ensure that the 4,000 who died in the frost are not forgotten in the rush of the future. Their names may be lost to us, but their experience is part of the soul of the land. We must listen to the silence they left behind. Manifest Destiny was a mask for greed. It turned a land grab into a crusade. It allowed people to commit atrocities while believing they were doing God's work. The Trail of Tears is the ultimate proof of how dangerous a destiny can be when it is fueled by the hunger for soil. The resilience of the native nations is the great unsolved problem for the architects of removal. They were supposed to vanish. They were supposed to fade away into the history books. But they are here, their cultures vibrant and their spirits unbowed by the weight of the past. The trail is a journey from light into dark and back again. It begins in the lush mountains of the east and ends in the hard-won sovereignty of the west. It is a story of the endurance of the human spirit against the overwhelming power of a state that wanted it dead. We must remember the physical details, the smell of the mud, the weight of the rag-wrapped feet, the taste of the bitter flour. These are the things that make the history real. These are the things that prevent it from becoming a dry, safe statistic in a textbook. The Cherokee Nation today is a testament to the failure of the removal. They are a powerful, modern, sovereign people. They have turned the site of their exile into a center of culture and commerce. The trail did not break them. It made them indestructible. But we must never forget the cost of that indestructibility. We must never forget the price paid in the frozen woods of 1838. The Trail of Tears is a story that must be told again and again, block by block, until the weight of the truth is as heavy as the trail itself. The ledger of the grim is never closed. New evidence of the removal continues to emerge, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. It is a part of the present, a ghost that walks beside us as we move through the landscape of a nation built on stolen ground. Let the final blocks of this chronicle settle into your mind. Let them be a reminder that history is a series of choices. The Trail of Tears was a choice. It was not inevitable. It was a calculated human act of cruelty that we must confront if we are to ever find grace. The wind still blows across the plains of Oklahoma. It carries the scent of the grass and the memory of the march. It is a wind that has seen the death of nations and the birth of a new kind of strength. It is a wind that will never stop telling the story. Tonight, as the lights go down, remember the Trail of Tears. Remember the frost, the fire, and the feet that never stopped walking. Remember that even in the darkest night of a nation's history, the spirit of a people can find its way home. The trail continues in the heart.